Everybody. Okay, we're very happy today, and we're really honored to have a very special person that will talk to us about, again, a unique experience of the world of academia with the world around us and within the environment and with nature and all these things. Heather Swan is not just any speaker today. She's also a very dear friend of mine. She teaches environmentalist literature and environment literature, and writing at UW Madison, University of Wisconsin at Madison. And she's also a poet. She has published, and a writer. She has published 2 collections of poetry. One is one is called A Kinship with Ash. I think this was her first one. And another one, her chapbook, The Edge of Damage, which won the Wisconsin Chapbook Award. She writes fiction, nonfiction, and she published a book titled Where Honeybees Thrive, Where Honeybees Thrive, Stories from the Field, and also won another award for this book. She's, as is from the book itself, the nonfiction book, she's a honeykeeper, she's a beekeeper, and she's also an environmentalist. She's very involved in her in the public sphere of Madison and all these kind of social issues. And she's also an artist, multi-talented person. It won't be enough for me to just, I think I will take the whole time if I want to really introduce the things that Heather is doing. So I will suffice with reading one of her poems. It's a short poem, but I love so much because I know Heather is also on my syllabus for teaching my students in Introduction to Literature, and they enjoy her poems a lot, and we discuss they give us a chance to discuss so many things. The poem I'm going to talk is a very special one that I also shared it with my children. It's titled On Breaking. Those early days when you were small enough to carry my entire life curved like a nautilus around you. You were separate, but not severed. Never have I been so raw, child, as I felt bringing you into this world of both violets and beheadings. How can we remain open? What choice do we have but to don our armor in order to go forth each day? But to be most alive, we must be willing to be broken over and over, to keep our palms open, those muscles in our chests unbarbed in whatever body we're given. So may you open like the orchid, my child, I beseech you. The wind blows, the leaves fall. There is no compass but love. Definitely, there is no compass but love, and I leave you with love, and I leave you with Heather Swan. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Duaa. That poem is very important to me. It's straight from the heart, of course. So what I hope today to do is to bring you something that's really from the heart, and it's less maybe about our academic selves, but more about ourselves as human beings in the world. And I'm going to talk about my journey into poetry and writing and teaching that actually involved my experience with honeybees. And so what I titled my talk was Unexpected Intimacies, Learning Interbeing from Honeybees. And I have actually written, since I was a little girl, I was someone who wrote in order to understand the world. And when I was a very small child, I lived in actually many places in the United States, but many different landscapes, because my mother was an artist and we moved frequently for that reason. But always the constant in my life was the land around me. And I spent a lot of time in prairies with my dog and on mountainsides. And in that experience of being in the natural world, I I never assumed that humans were superior to all of the other beings around us. And it was just sort of an innate understanding that I had about the sort of the sacredness of other creatures. And so when I became an adult, I started being interested in honey bees and beekeeping. And when I did it, I first thought that the reason I was doing it is because I thought they were really wonderful, that they could make honey. But what I learned was that the bees themselves had so much to teach me. And so I felt that I was learning about the bee community. And then I thought I would like to take that material that I was learning and bring it to other people. I'm going to show you a little video of my experience with bees. This picture, it shows me very much in protective gear. And I wanted to show you a little video that shows how my relationship with them changed pretty dramatically. I got to a point where I was much more comfortable with them. And so I'm just going to show you this little video. So you can see that the bees are very, very gentle at this time. And the reason that they're clustered together like that, I don't know if you can see, but I'm holding on to a little strip of metal, and inside of that cluster of bees is a queen. And the bees are all gathered around that queen because she emits a pheromone that says, this is where you should be, this is your community. And so they're all gathered around her because they are going to find this new home, and they want to make sure that she's getting fed and she's taken care of. And in that moment, they're very gentle. And so what I was doing was I was placing that queen inside the hive, and you'll see that the bees are just, at this point, they're so docile, and their only interest is to keep their community healthy. And it's through these bees that I'm so sorry. It's through the bees that I have a big, I'm so sorry.
It's all right. It's all right. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. So you can see that my relationship with the bees went from one of being sort of nervous about them to being really comfortable. And what I did was I started thinking a lot about how my work could reflect the things that I learned about the world from bees. To me, the prose that I write is more like all of the flowers in the meadow, and prose is sort of filled with lots of different kinds of things, right? There, there's the trees and the flowers and the grasses, but the honey from those flowers has been distilled. It's all of that meadow distilled down. And so to me, poetry is like the honey of language. And so I've written 2 recent books that are very much a reflection of this experience of being with bees. And I would say that the interconnection that bees have is something that informs all of my work, and that the idea of drawing and distilling down the very most poignant and meaningful things comes out in my poetry. And I'm going to share a little bit of my poetry with you, but at first I'm going to just kind of talk sort of more broadly about my scholarship. So in the work that I do as a researcher, I've spent a lot of time thinking about literary studies and environmental studies. And part of this was born out of the realization that the honeybee was suddenly in trouble. And in fact, all pollinators were in great, in great danger because of the habits that we have of destroying the planet. And so I started thinking, oh, I need to find out who the bad guy is. Who's the bad guy that is destroying the honeybees and the pollinators. And of course, I learned very quickly that there was no bad guy, that in fact, it had to do with our relationship with the land and our relationship with each other. And so I wrote this book, and what I did was I thought I wanted to outline the problems, but I wanted to find strategies for a change, and thinking about both practical applications of things we could do to make the earth and the people that live on the earth healthier and safer. And at the same time, also draw upon the literary study side and think about what kinds of theoretical moves can we make in our writing and our artwork that will actually encourage the kinds of thinking that will bring our world to a saner place. And so that was really the work that I did in Where Honeybees Thrive. And the poetry book is much more broadly thinking about humans in relationship to the natural world. And sometimes that use of nature in the poetry is very much metaphorical. And sometimes it's more specifically eco-poetry. And I'm going to talk a little bit about nature poetry and eco-poetry. And what I did was I started thinking about what it is that we're actually doing. And I thought of this quote by Rainer Maria Rilke. It is our task to imprint this temporary, perishable earth into ourselves so deeply, so painfully and passionately that its essence can rise again invisibly inside us. We are the bees of the invisible. We wildly collect the honey of the visible to store it in the great golden hive of the invisible. And I love this quote, and I feel like it's been a guide for me thinking about how we take in all of the beautiful and all of the difficult in the world, all of the perishable earth, and how we transform that in ourselves. I started thinking a little bit about nature poetry in the pre-Islamic world and in the Arabian Peninsula. And it was interesting because I started to realize that, of course, beekeeping was around, and our relationship with honeybees happened a long time before anyone was writing romantic nature poetry in English. And so it was interesting for me to realize that the Apis mellifera jemenitica, is far more heat tolerant than the Apis mellifera that I work with in the United States. And this is an insect that is very clearly a resilient. This bee can survive in the desert, so it's a very resilient bee. And so it was interesting to me to realize that in pre-Islamic nature poetry, there is this image of the bee that arrives. And I won't take you through all the details, but it was striking to me that that the poetry, the nature poetry, especially of these pre-Islamic poets, seem to have this awareness of the struggle for survival in harsh conditions of the desert, and also an awareness of the resilience of animals. So there was a way in which the poets were connecting to the non-human world in a way that I think was lost and is now being invited back into our consciousness, because we have, with industrialization and technology, there's been this split from the non-human world and the human world. But in fact, these relationships are so old, right? And the other thing that in these poets was that there was also an affectionate an affection for the past, sort of a nostalgia. And so some of the images were much more about the simple and happy life. And I think that there's this idea that the natural world can, and especially bees, can be thought of as representing healing and fertility as well. And I also looked at, and again, I'm not a scholar at all of the Quran, and so I won't suggest any kind of interpretation to this. But one of the very first times that Duaa and I had connected, I was thinking about bees all the time, and she sent me these quotes from the Quran, and I was struck by the line, "There is indeed a sign in that for people who reflect on the bees." And I think about, even to this day, I'm constantly asking this question of what is it that we are supposed to learn from the bees, right? And so my own experience, like I said, was thinking about interconnection, that all beings are participating in ecosystems and in a global community, and all of these beings need respect. And in fact, that in the hive, there are all of these different bees that do different jobs. There are worker bees that are gathering honey. There are nurse bees that are taking care of the young bees. There's the queen that is really producing all of the eggs in the hive. There are the bees that are, making honey. So there are a lot of different jobs going on. And I think of this as in a community, we have all of these different disciplines that we all are working on these problems and thinking about how to be human beings, right? In this community or this hive space. And that all of those beings are equally important. If you take one honeybee out of the hive and isolate it from the community, it won't live, it will die. And so the importance of community is really one of the things that I learned from the bees. I also think about, from my own experience of my traveling with the bees, I had this sense of great wonder. I was stunned always by the miraculous things that bees can do that we can't do. For example, a bee can navigate by the angle of the sun. It dances a map to other bees in the darkness of the hive to a flower that might be 2 miles away from the hive. And all of the other bees understand this dance and can go and visit that exact same flower. That's miraculous to me. I actually am just often stunned by the ways in which bees have these qualities that are beyond human understanding. They also have an amazing sense of smell. But the other thing about bees is that they do this incredible thing, which is a very selfless act. I remember one time I had my bees were all out in the yard, and it suddenly rained. And I was picking up the bees out of the grass because they couldn't fly because their wings were wet. So I was taking them and carrying them back to the hive. And I had at one point 2 bees in my hand. And one of the bees had a torn wing, and the other bee was just soaking wet. And they were both like kind of, trying to get all the water off of their wings. And they were both sort of, we could argue that both of them were suffering from they were both stressed. And once they realized that there were 2 bees in my hand, they immediately went together and began to care for the other. And I thought, how beautiful, right? That the bees would suddenly not worry about their own situation, but instead think, oh, there's someone in my community that also needs help. I will go and administer care. And I thought that was so beautiful too. And so I am filled with wonder. I also recognize that the bees tell me that there's a warning here that we should notice. And it's that the world is a fragile, beautiful place, and it needs to be treated with care because so many bees were dying. And I thought, okay, what's going on here? The pollinators are dying. They're a warning to us that the ecosystems could collapse. And to think about this, eco poetry is one of the solutions for me, because it's what I have. offer. Many people have science, or they have different ways of doing teaching and communicating, and all of you who are students are probably on your path to thinking about what your discipline will be, how you will offer help into the world, this world. And so, but the warning part for me is that we all need to pay attention and think about what it is that we can bring, right? My poetry is part love song and part elegy to the natural world and to human beings. It's also an invitation to radical reimagining, thinking about a future that can be more connected, more engaged in healing practices rather than destructive practices. So I think that I'm going to just mention the author Rob Nixon right now, who maybe some of you have heard of before. Rob Nixon was one of the he was one of the mentors for me for my projects. He was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I know that Duaa also had met with Dr. Nixon, and his ideas were very, very influential and impacted me greatly. Especially his book, Slow Violence, Environmentalism of the Poor, which invites us to think differently about the idea of violence, which often the violences that we think about are fast, huge, explosive violence. But what he invites us to think about is that there are other kinds of violence that unfold incrementally, that are not as obvious to the eye, and instead they're for example, the poisoning of a stream, which would eventually cause a cancer in a body. This is the kind of violence that is not readily observable, but is indeed violence. And he's very passionate about noticing that the things that are happening in the environment, the people who will suffer the most from these kinds of slow violences are often people who are on the lowest income levels, that have the least amount of social mobility or even material mobility, geographical mobility. So this was an invitation to me to think about how to write my book. And I think that one of the things that we see is that environmental disaster is, habitat destruction, mass extinction, issues of environmental justice, all of these things are unfolding. So Rob Nixon says, how do we offer something different for people so that they understand these slow violences and also are given possibly hope, right? So these are sort of some things that that I think about and the things that have sort of guided my writing. And so I will just keep going here. So I started thinking about what exactly eco-poetry is for me, and I was thinking about this quote of Goethe's that states that poetry is the common property of all mankind, and that it is manifest everywhere and in all ages and hundreds of people. Poetry has been with us, for centuries and centuries. And I feel that one of the things that I think about a lot is that when we think about poetry, we think about metaphor. And in fact, all language is metaphor. Every time we have a word that is signifying any object, we're making a metaphor. What poetry does in a time when languages are very complicated and very pedestrian is that it brings us back to a place of potential insight and inspiration, because it distills that language down. Like I said before, it's this, this very intense unit of language. And to think that the poetry is not for just, not just one group of people, but instead for all of mankind, really touched me. And I hope that my poetry can live up to all these things that I'm saying. Goethe also said, national literature is no longer of much account. The age of world literature is upon us, and everyone must work to hasten its arrival. So this was written along, Goethe is not a contemporary. So it's interesting to think that he was he was predicting that we would be having conversations like the one we're having today, where this is across languages, across the world, and how beautiful that is, that poetry can be a way, a bridge for us to be having these conversations. And a much more contemporary, actually a professor who lives in Iowa in the United States recently wrote a book of poetry. He's an eco critic. And he said of eco poetry that it performs an act of radical anticipation, envisioning new ways of existing on an earth that humans no longer dominate, but instead to think of, instead of this domination, to imagine a coexistence that is much more sane and will allow us to have a sustainable future on the planet. I thought that was quite beautiful as well. And finally, sorry. Oh dear, let's see. I want to say that Amitav Ghosh, who is probably a scholar that many of you know from India, said the planet will never come alive for you unless your songs and stories give life to all the beings seen and unseen that inhabit a living earth. This also just really touched me, and I felt like I'd like to share that idea that to all the beings seen and unseen, unseen maybe because they're off the radar of our academic world, or maybe because they're non-human beings, or maybe there are things that we haven't even discovered that could be shared. So I feel like that's also a guiding concept for me in my work. So at this point, I think maybe I'll read a few poems, and what I'll do is I'll try to share my screen so that you can see the poems as I'm reading them. And Duaa actually read one of the poems that I was planning to read, so I will skip that one, but I'll read 4 poems, and then I would love to talk with all of you and hear what your thoughts are. And I'll say a little bit about each of the pieces as I begin the poem, so that that you can kind of get a sense of why I was writing each one. Let's see. So the first one I'm going to read is, oops, that's not the one I was going to read. Let's see. Hold on one moment. I'm so sorry. Let me try this. It's funny because I was planning on reading from the book, and then Duaa said, oh, it would be good if everyone could see the pieces as you read them. So let me see if this is,
I can share some of the Victor poems because
okay, here we go. I think we have it here. So so this poem is called Directive, and I have to admit that this was a poem that was written during the time that my father was dying, and it was one of his favorite poems by Robert Frost, a poem called Directive. And so it's a way of honoring my father. It's also a way of honoring my, the poetic forefathers. And but this poem is written in a time of imagining that we need to start again. We need to think about remaking our map. And so in this moment when things are so chaotic, how can we start again? And so the idea is the directive to edify our humanness and think about how to move forward in a more sane way. The poem is Directive. In this world of waters, the unleashed waters, we wend our way, not heeding the beacons, while the snow geese wait for ice that never arrives, and swans move southward but tarry. Who designed our faulty compass? We must stop now and scrape the soil clear of plastic shards and dead grass, and with our fingernails etch a new map, born of bone, aware of our kinship with ash with crickets, with wrens. This poem was very much thinking about climate change and thinking about the ways in which we have unleashed this kind of new situation that's quite overwhelming. But one of the things that I think about all the time is that if we cultivate a kinship with all of the beings, with the crickets and the wrens and with each other, and also are aware of our kinship with ash, with our potential for destruction, our own mortality, that maybe these things would guide us in a way that would allow for a world that was a bit more, if we had a bit more gentle impact on each other and on the planet, it could be a really beautiful, a really beautiful world, in my opinion. The second poem I'll read is a poem called Victor, and it's very much, you'll see, connected to my relationship with honeybees. This poem is from a series of poems that are based on I mean, it's so strange to have pesticide poems, but the reason for these poems is that I learned that pesticides, which of course are devastating to all insects, but also many other creatures, including human beings, pesticides are named these things like Victor, Freedom, Warrant, Luna, just Vespers. I'll read the Vespers poem. When I learned that pesticide chemicals, pesticide companies were naming these deadly chemicals with words that I found beautiful, I felt inspired to write a series of poems that were based on taking those words back from the pesticide companies. And so I wrote this poem, for example, called Victor, because there is a pesticide called Victor. So here it is, Pesticide 7, Victor. The handfuls of dead bees she finds after the spraying are not the worst part for the beekeeper. It's the bees still struggling that get to her, limping in a circle like someone who's been spinning on a tire swing for too long, who then stands dizzy, nauseous, stunned. Their wings shudder, but they cannot fly. These insects whose bodies know the rhythm of the blossoms, the changing angles of the sun, whose alchemy gives us liquid gold, whose love affairs with pistils and stamens give us apricots, almonds, melons. To witness is to be dredged, she thinks. What war do we think we're winning? And the next
I'm sorry,
poem,
we did not see the poem. We did not see the poem. Did you exhibit it on the screen? Because we still have directive.
Oh, you did. I'm so sorry. Here we go. Can you see this one?
We still have directive.
Oh, so funny. Let me try again. Oh.
I can share the poem.
Yeah, okay. I think maybe what I can also do is I can send them to you all so that you can look at them again after the meeting. But for this one, let's see, Duaa, I'm going to try to read Vespers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see it?
I do have Victor and Vespers. If I'm given the chance to...
Do you see it from my screen?
Let me see.
Yes.
Okay.
Ah, yeah, Vespers, it's there.
Okay, so Vespers, Pesticide 5, Vespers. By the lake's edge at dusk, a raft of lavender ice is being consumed by the warming blue. Seagulls reel and vie for what is vanishing months too soon. Red-winged blackbirds clamor for the foreground as a train whistle spools through the town. The boxcars heaped with coal. The factory hums on, its wires reliably pulsing so we can endlessly use our phones. A Greyhound bus roars along a bank of trees and two long boats scissor the water below, scullers thrusting to the shouts of the coxswain, embodying the churn of forward motion humans seem to love. But here, on a mat of branches and sand, quiet as monastics in a chapel, two cranes stand perfectly still. This poem, to me, was actually just purely a revelation. I was standing on a lake's edge and recognizing that the ice of this lake where I live, which was melting too soon, possibly by anthropogenic climate change, it was so amazing because all of these things happened. I did hear the whistle of the train, and I could hear the factory, and I thought, we are just moving and moving forward with this churn, and there were these two beautiful cranes standing still, and I thought, oh yes, we need to return to some amount of stillness. So I think maybe I'll read one last poem, and it's really, I'm hoping that it's a very hopeful poem, and then I hope to hear from all of you and answer some questions. It's interesting. I know that this has been it's not a typical academic presentation, and it's much more personal and filled with a blend of the academic and the passions that I have. And I feel that I was given permission to do that because of my relationship with Duaa. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to share one more poem.
It's our honor, Heather. It's so beautiful. Dr. Swan, actually, I just ignored this title, actually. Yes, go ahead.
So this poem is a poem that will be appearing in a journal soon, but it's not in my most recent collection. And it's written about again, it's interesting because it's written near a lake. You can start to understand that my geography is very much reflected in my work. But this poem is much more about what I believe is the miracle of being alive, that we've been given this gift to live on the planet. And I want to just quote Mahmoud Darwish, who says, there is on this land what is worth living for. And I feel like this happens all the time to me, that I recognize that there is just the miracle of being able with our bodies to experience the miracle of this life, that we don't often think about it. It's very much we're busy doing our busy days. We are working, we are thinking, we are getting to class, or we are we're worried about how to pay the light bill. And I think that when we pause for a moment and recognize that each of these moments is a gift, and so I wrote this poem trying to sort of encapsulate that feeling of wonder that I have. It's called Lake Edge January. In the same way ice carries light, by which I mean changed, intensified, by which I mean kaleidoscopic or transformed, by which I mean a suddenly visible spectrum from violet to cerulean to rose, this body, by which I mean this thorax, this spine, this skin, carries awareness. This being, these beings, by which I mean all, by which I mean carp, antelope, lichen, and birds, the lightest of all who live on wind, are allowed to bear witness to gravity, to iron, to calcium and blood, to the shimmer of rime ice, to the glint of gold on a honeybee wing, to the flint of a lover's eye, this gleam of late afternoon sun, and to witness also fists and teeth and breakage and war, so briefly, so very briefly, by which I mean death, by which I mean you may shine before the end. So thank you for listening to my poems, and I am very excited to hear your ideas and questions and any feedback that you have.
Wow, thank you very, very much, Heather, for such a beautiful and very different kind of experience that you allowed us to have in this discussion. As you said, yes, who said that academia shouldn't be filled with passion, shouldn't be filled with wonder? Isn't this what we are trying to actually do all the time? So I think that this was very telling in that sense. Yeah. I know that you're also a teacher, and I'm sure that you're taking a lot of this and share it with your own students. So maybe this is something that at a certain point you would like to talk about. But I'll leave this now, the opportunity for others if they want to ask any questions. So yeah, is there any kind of comment, reflection, question? Yes. So yeah, we have Sulaf, and then we have an iPhone. The name is not clear. So yes, we'll start with Sulaf, one of my students. Yes.
Yes. Hello, Doctor. Hello, Dr. Heather Swan. And I really like your poems. That's so powerful and so beautiful. But I have 2 questions. Can I ask?
Yes,
sure.
The first one, when did you start writing poems, and who is your idol?
Oh, those are great questions. So it's interesting because I thank you for your question. I started writing poetry when I was really little, and I think that part of it was I didn't know it was poetry at the time, but I would write down these. To be honest, the first real poem that I wrote was written when I was 8 years old, and it was a love poem to a tree that I was leaving because I moved so often as a child. I had this relationship with this tree. I would go outside and sit under it every day, and I was so saddened to be leaving that tree. So the first poem that the first formal poem that I ever wrote was to this tree. And the thing is that when I was growing up, my life was I had a difficult childhood in some ways. I encountered different kinds of violence, and one of the things that I found really healing was the poetry of other people. And I would go to poems and discover that there were ways to manage, to get through the suffering, and to remember that beauty existed even in times when I felt like I wasn't sure that there was very much beauty. And so poetry really saved my life when I was maybe in middle school and high school. So ages 12 to 18, and then really getting serious about writing poetry myself. I really have been doing that since I was in high school. And the second question is so good, because I think that when I write anything now, I think about writing for, not writing actually for people specifically in academia, but rather any person that is interested in thinking deeply about our relationship with the world, meaning all of the other humans and also all of the other non-humans. And so my work, even my scholarship, is transformed into a style of writing that I feel would be accessible to, like, my mother, who is a person who is not a scholar. She didn't finish college, but I think that she is a person who cares about the world, and so I think about writing for an audience like that. Does that help?
Yes, thank you, and it's so good and beautiful, and thank you, and I wish for you more success in your life.
Thank you.
Thank you, Salah. Okay, we're gonna take Dr. Munir bin Zed, please. Yes, and then I'll take more than one question, Heather. So if you can take just notes, so that we can give more opportunities.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duaa, for this opportunity to join the platform. It's a great pleasure to listen to speakers from all over the world. And I have a very simple question to Heather. First of all, I enjoyed listening to your speech because it breaks the rules and talks about something which is more or less striking the different discourse or language you're using to talk about bees. And my question is on for someone who has very little background on the language of bees, or the language bees can speak in the absence of words, is how to build, is there any way to build intimacy? You're talking about intimacy with honeybees. How to build intimacy with honeybees? Because is there any practical way or particular steps one can follow to avoid the risk? Because honeybees are not always gentle. There is a risk. I mean, you may take the risk. And is there any practical way or systematic way, or is it a question of a predisposition which is given to certain people, like poets, for instance? Thank you very much again.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And I'll say that I did not know the language immediately. And I often I have definitely had moments where I was schooled, as they say, by the bees when I moved too quickly or didn't respect their energy. And I think that it is something that you can learn. And certainly the science shows us that you can learn the bees the dances that they do by studying the path that they make, the amount of times that the body is of the worker bee is dancing, what distance, what angle, how, the duration, the speed of the vibration, all of those things are absolutely being studied so that they can understand how the bees are communicating with each other. But I will say that the other part for me is that I learned when I approached a hive that I had to bring my own energy into a very peaceful, calm place. And so if you remember that video, my voice was quiet, my body was very still. I learned that behavior because at first, if you move quickly around a bee, they'll feel the energy of nervousness, and then they'll start to feel, threatened. And so I think it's very much about breathing and bringing your energy to a place where you're not, anytime that I went weirdly with ego or with a sense of domination, I quickly, I would get stung. Every time. And so I really had to learn to be humble and to respect where they were. At times I knew that I shouldn't approach them. And I think it's very much like how we are with human beings. There are some times when other humans feel approachable and sometimes they don't. And it's just learning to read their signals, I guess. I hope that's a good answer. Thank you so much for the question and for the comment about my doing a very different kind of academic presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Heather. Yes, Abdurrahman, and then we'll move to Muhammad Talal. We'll take 2 questions at a time, Heather. Okay? Yes, Abdurrahman.
Okay, Doctor. At first, I would like to thank you all for giving us this opportunity to be here and talk to you, especially you, Dr. Heather Swan. My question is, through your poems, I have noticed that you can express your feelings and yourself in general by writing very well, by writing poems especially. So is that an innate thing or something is inborn, or have you returned yourself to do this, to be a poet like this, who can express his feelings and himself in all by writing poems? Because you said that you start writing when you was very little.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, are you done with your questions, Abdurrahman?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And let's just move quickly to Muhammad, and then, you can respond to their questions. Yes, Muhammad. Muhammad, do you hear me? Okay, then we'll take Nadine. Nadine?
Yes, Doctor. Hi, Doctor. I want to ask, what is the feeling that you wanted to convey to the reader in Honeybees?
Okay, thank you. Yes. Heather, you can. Yeah.
Okay, so the first question it might be that do I feel that being a poet is something that's innate, or is it something that can be learned? And I think it's interesting because I grew up in a family of artists, and this painting behind me, for example, is my father's work, and my mother made pottery, and because we lived among artists all the time, I think that that the language of image was very much the language that I saw being spoken. And so writing poetry for me was a very natural way of talking, because of speaking about things that were happening internally, because it was the way that I understood the world. Because there was so much visual metaphor around me, it made sense to speak in visual, or in metaphor, also in language. And so I think that it was something that I grew up in. But I also feel very strongly that once I thought that I knew that I wanted to cultivate my poetic side, I certainly became an avid reader of other poets. And I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, I'm in a chain of poets who are, you know, incredibly brilliant, insightful human beings who are thinking about what it means to be on this planet that's filled with suffering and also filled with beauty. And so I've gleaned so much from the work that's come before me. So I think that that it's maybe it's two-sided. I think that it was part of who I was because of where I grew up and with whom I grew up. But I think that I also invited all those other poets into my life by studying literature. And my PhD was actually in literary studies and environmental studies. And but before that, I got an MFA in poetry, which meant that I was soaking myself in poetry every day. And so the poetic understandings certainly inform my prose as well. And the second question, what was the feeling that I wanted to convey with the honeybee book? And I think that, you know, it's so interesting that you asked that question. And the way that I was introduced by Duaa is exactly it. I think that ultimately what I wanted was to invite everyone to experience this love that I recognize in myself when I'm working with bees, but also with bees to each other. We wouldn't normally call there's that danger of anthropomorphizing that we always are afraid of. But in some ways, I think that this idea of anthropomorphizing, the fear of anthropomorphizing is actually limiting the experience of other beings. What if it is love that they experience, right? And so I felt like it was a love song to the bees, and the feeling that I have with them is one of great reverence. And it's taught me to try to have reverence for the people in my community and all of the individuals that I meet. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you for it.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes, we have Muhammad. I wonder if he's still there. And we have another one.
Yasmin, by the way. I just thought it's my brother's laptop.
Oh, yeah. All right. Okay, Yasmin. Yes, go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
First of all, good afternoon, Dr. Heather. Good afternoon, Dr. Duaa. It's such a pleasure, to read all your poems, and they were very interesting, I have to say. I have a couple of questions. Can I ask each one at a time?
Yeah.
Okay, my first question, you kind of answered my first question. You were telling us about your bees and your story. It was actually throughout your poems, I've realized that you always, embody the theme of nature. What is your inspiration behind that? I figured out that it was bees from what you said, but is there any other inspirations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say that, bees have been what I've written about, but I would say that my relationship with the natural world is, so when I was a little girl, I because I moved so much, I didn't have a lot of long-term human friendships. I had a friendship with my dog, and my dog and I kind of did all the exploring and all of the adventures together. There's a story that I'll tell you about when I lived in the mountains. My mom would she would tie a string onto the front of the house, and it was this big huge ball of yarn, and then I could go up into the mountains as long as I was carrying the yarn that was unspooling. And I'd go with my dog, and the two of us would go way, way, way up into the mountains, but we had this little string that would keep us from, if we got lost, she could follow the string. Or we wouldn't get lost because we could follow the string back. But my point is that I was outside so much of the time, and it's where I find solace now, still. And I absolutely feel like I have cultivated relationships with, interestingly, birds. I had a very unusual experience with a particular owl, for example, before my father died, and it was extraordinary. Every relationship that I have with a non-human being, I just think of as a gift. I'm so stunned that I could be trusted by a non-human being, and so I hope to carry all of that energy of being a good listener and being a gentle part of the natural world to my human community. And so, yeah, I'm very much informed by many parts of nature. The weather, the patterns of death and rebirth and in the seasons, and they're incredible. I have not lived in a desert, but also there are ways in which certain communities of plants and animals can survive these extreme weather events, and also, we live in a place where it gets very cold, but also the very, very hot places. I mean, it's incredible, like how nature can survive. And I think that that's also incredible. The resilience that nature models for us is quite beautiful. So does that answer your first question?
Yes, it does. That's actually very beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
My other question it's about poems and poetry in general. Like, with time, did the process of writing poetry change for you? And if it did, like, in what way? Like, where is the passion for writing poetry, if you're getting my question?
Mm-hmm. I think, it's probably maybe when I was in my 20s, my poetry was more sort of self-focused and thinking about like how I personally could manage being in the world. But I think that my poems turned outward much more. I think that your maybe in your class you read a poem called Empath, and some of my poems are thinking about a message that I've had in my life that I think that we should all be thinking about. And the poem, for those of you that haven't read it, is about my son.
I've actually read your poems, and I've searched your name online. I was actually speechless when I saw all your different poems. They're very beautiful, and I found many different poems. So I actually was interested. I generally was very interested.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I think we're gonna move to Rama, and then.
Can I just ask one last question?
Yeah, just let us give others, my dear Yasmin, and then we'll get back to you. Okay. I hope you don't mind. We will. Inshallah, we'll have the time. Rama.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Duaa and Dr. Heather. I have a question and a comment. So when I read your poems for the first time, I was just like, why did you choose bees in general? Like, I believe that ants, for example, have a kind of political community, just like bees, like queen and everything. And my comment is, so I once read that bees are the most important creatures because they Without them, we will have no plants, and in result, no animals and no humans. So I just wanted to say that it's just magnificent how such a little creatures are affecting our world, and not only in like nature, but also in art and poetry. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
And it's not
Okay.
just the honeybee, obviously, it's all of the pollinators that are allowing us to eat. I think that there are arguments that 1/3 of all of the food that we eat is dependent upon insect pollinators. And that's a pretty large number of bites of food. So we're grateful to those insects.
Yeah, without them we'll suffer from famine. Okay, or we won't have the taste that we're having right now.
Exactly. Right.
Sure. There is one, but the name is not showing. It says iPhone. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question or to make a comment? Okay, so we'll go back to Yasmin and then to see her last question. She has something else to add or to ask. Yasmin, are you there? Yeah, go ahead.
It is common for a poet to face difficulties composing some poems, and it usually takes longer time to write a certain poem. Would you say that you have like ever faced this issue? And if you did, how do you try to overcome it?
So I have friends who are poets who write a poem every day. And I think that's amazing. Like, I don't know how they can possibly do that. I write really slowly. And I play with language a lot, and I revise and revise and revise. And sometimes the feeling is, the feeling that I am trying to convey just it's not working. So I just have to keep revisiting it until I finally feel like I've come to a place that it's finally making sense to my ear, and to and honoring the sense that I want to create with the poem. Does that answer the question?
Yes. So meaning what you're saying is that you have certain emotions and feelings that you're trying to give to the reader. If I'm thinking about becoming a poemist, since I've had a passion for poems for a very long time, how can I achieve this skill?
Mm-hmm. I would say begin writing. And I think that when you're feeling very passionate about something, that you can start to try to explain that feeling in writing. I always suggest to students that they think about returning to the body and also to images in the world. Sometimes we see something, we see someone close their umbrella and stand in the rain and let the rain fall on them. And that suddenly that image of someone closing the umbrella and standing in the rain is like, why are they doing that? And so I would say, pay attention to these things that you notice. Maybe it's that a bunch of birds lift off together and you think, what does that mean to me? Is there an expansiveness in your heart? But those images are the ones that are going to that mean something to someone else as well. And so I would say, pay attention to the things that you notice in the world, and also try to articulate with metaphor what those experiences are in your own heart.
Yes, thank you so much. It was a great opportunity.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Malik. Dr. Malik Zarqat.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled actually listening to this phenomenal presentation. I love the talk and the way the poet talks herself and introduces her poetry. However, I am just concerned about two main probably points. First of all, I'm just worried or concerned with the fact that pre-modern, pre-Islamic Arabic poetry did not, I'm afraid, consider nature seriously as an inspiration. That's one, probably something to reconsider, I'm just saying. But regarding Heather's poetry, nature is there, and this line of passion is there in the Western tradition from the time of the Greek till our day today, I mean. So if I'm just to hear from the poet about how she just view herself in terms of romantic English romanticism, in terms of American transcendentalist, and in terms of modern imagism, Does she believe that she is introducing all these at once? We are dealing with, and I'm pretty sure that the language she uses is a combination of all these at once, like while listening to her first poem, seems as if you are reading for Wordsworth. Then you jump to the third as if you are reading for Ezra Pound. So it's like a collage there. I enjoyed it definitely. And that's probably an experience of a very meticulous postmodern poet. I love that. But I would love to hear from you about that, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. And I think that the part, I am not a scholar of pre-Islamic poetry by any stretch. I did some research thinking about pre-Islamic poetry as poetry that talked about nature, where nature was part of the story. And the part that seemed to be a mention of, when I said inspiring, I think it was that in one particular poem, I remember there is the recognition that a deer, for example, could survive this harsh landscape. So the landscape was very much, it was one of those man versus nature kinds of tropes, certainly, that was the overwhelming, just from the very little that I dipped in, and I would love to learn more from you about it. But the inspiring part that I felt was that there were certain things that survived, like the bee survived and the deer survived. And so that was maybe I shouldn't have used it with the word inspiration. Certainly not like romanticism, which is very opposite, right? Where nature is a place of edification, and it's very much. I mean, you bring up Wordsworth, and I think about like the romantic sublime was certainly, in my opinion, a reaction to industrialization, and we couldn't get to a place of like romanticizing nature unless we had an urban reality that the human was writing within, right? And so in my own work, I mean, I think that I return to the romantic sublime a lot, because I think about, like I invite my students to think about it, because in some ways, imagining that there is something profoundly powerful, beautiful, but also slightly terrifying in the natural world would maybe rekindle our sense of respect, right? I mean, I think that at the time that most romantic poetry was written, there is this awareness that the earth was powerful, right? I mean, but also in a time when this industry was just beginning. And now we're at a place in the Anthropocene where we're saying, wait a second, we were so successful at that now, you know, the scales are tipping. And I think that my own work, absolutely, it braids together all kinds of different strands. I think, you know, I certainly read Pound and think about the power of the image. I also read a lot of contemporary poets, and I feel that some of them are lyricists, some of them are thinking about doing what we call, you know, there's some poets that are doing like environmental poetry, which is very much about, I think, I would say that it's political, right? And it's got an agenda, and then there are poets that are doing these sort of lyrical pieces or narrative pieces that are honoring the natural world in elegiac ways. And some of them are returning to sort of a more romantic. Certainly, there's the pastoral, but then there's like the modern version of the pastoral, which is a more eco-critical approach, where you might write about the BP oil disaster, for example, or something like that. But yeah, in my own work, I think I don't adhere to one tradition. I certainly read the Transcendentalists as well. But I think that I wouldn't place myself. I suppose it would be up to an eco-critic to place me in a category, but I don't think of myself as fitting easily into one. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Thank you.
perfect. I love that. Thanks very much for this nice elaboration. And sorry, just to explain one thing, if Dr. Duaa allows me for that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead, yeah.
Sorry, my remark regarding pre-Islamic poetry, all I'm just saying is that you are doing phenomenal when it comes to talk about your poetry, when reading your poetry, and definitely your language talks itself by itself. And it would just be like something you don't want to risk to talk about, like pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, because it has almost, sorry for that, but it has nothing to do with the art you're doing. You are doing something very postmodern, and as you are saying, it brings almost the entire Western tradition into just one melting pot, so that critics of postmodern English poetry would just enjoy reading them by themselves without trying to establish any intertextual relations with other world literatures. But definitely we can enjoy what you are saying, and you do look like a poet, and you are, and the image behind you definitely talks a lot about the way you manipulate language, which is something I would love actually definitely to write a paper probably about in the near future. So thank you very much for this nice presentation. You're an inspiration.
I think that one of the reasons why I felt it was important to mention the pre-Islamic poets is because they wrote about bees long before. I mean, Virgil was writing about bees, right? But I mean, I think like, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, it's not all written in English. There's, you know,
I mean, Heather and Dr. Malik, I don't see why she shouldn't talk about them. And this is an experience, and this is why we're opening up to the world. And I think that there has been also a very interesting relationship between the poets and nature, especially Shamfara, for example. If you read about his relationship to animals and the way he treated them as his own family, I think this is brilliant. So I don't think that this is only it should be exclusive in that sense. But anyways, this is not our discussion. But thank you for all your comments.
He's right that I'm not an expert in that at all.
Yeah, definitely. But there's nothing wrong with getting to know that. No, we're still going to do our project about the bees. Don't worry about that. Okay, Dr. Jihad. Yeah, unmute, Dr. Jihad. Unmute your mic.
A second. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heather, for this very interesting presentation and talk. In fact, I found myself attached and attracted to each and every word of your presentation. I am not a man of letters. I am a psycholinguist. But a psycholinguist who loves poetry and who loves literature, and in a sense, a poet. I published on metaphors, but not metaphors of bees, of fear. But probably in the future, like what Malik said, may also be interested in bees and their metaphors. But what is really metaphorical and important for me is that we, all the time, my honey then tonight means my bees also, because bees are honey, and bees inspire poetry. So if you say to someone, then you're my honey, then probably you are a source of inspiration for me to compose poetry. Thank you very much for this illuminating talk. In fact, just back to Malik and Duaa, yes, the pre-Islamic poetry celebrated nature. And Shamfara is just an exemplar. I'm now reading or reciting in Arabic, Heather, the opening of Shamfara's a great poem, yes. أقيموا بني أمي صدور مطيكم فإني إلى قوم سواكم لأميل فقد حمت الغايات والليل مقمر وشدت لطيات مطايا وأرحل. Now the greatest verse. ولي دونكم, he is now addressing his tribe. ولي دونكم أهلونا سود عملس وأرقة زهلول وعرفاء جيئل. He's saying Heather to his tribe, I am giving you up to my friends in the wild, to bears and tigers and hyenas. These are my family, my tribe, instead of you. What yani, this is, you may not find
you are right.
this attachment to nature and celebration of nature. Now, just one little thing before my question. You talked about nature, protection of nature, and a stream being poisoned and maybe killing thousands of people or leading to cancer. This is fine, but it's not just bees. Bees can be metaphorical for human beings. We are in a region where there is not invisible violence like this stream being poisoned, but visible violence where bees, real bees, human beings, young bees, young children, before they yield honey, they are also killed. And so there is also a connection between bees and life, bees and human beings, bees and violence. And we are here in this region interested also in seeing more and more honey rather than bees being killed while they are still young. You may wish to know that in my last poem was Psalms of a Palestinian Mother, and I also used bees in my poem. To all these sons and all these heads, I bestowed my seeds, which have turned into fields of wheat that have filled all these lands, and turned into beehives that have populated all those roots and others. And then the poem continues to unfold. Now the thing is, yes, we want to protect nature, and we want also all creatures, all sorts of creatures, to continue to live and thrive. And human beings are topping the list in an area where violence is prevailing. Now, if you accept part of what I say, then how can aggressors learn from bees? Bees that give honey and aggressors that breed death. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you for the absolutely beautiful recitation of both in when reading in English your own poetry, but also the beautiful Arabic poetry. I feel like that language is so beautiful, and English is so not beautiful to listen to. But so that's on my list, is to learn more. You ask a really difficult question, and I think that one of the things that I have to admit that yeah, I'm very aware of how incredibly violent humans can be, and the fast violence that you're talking about is prevalent everywhere. I think that the violences that exist in the United States today are quite different than the violences that are experienced in different parts of the world, obviously. But we have a very violent culture also. And I think that one of the things that's striking to me about returning to the natural world is that there are moments that we can look at and we can say, oh, this is violent, you know, this animal eats this animal. But what I like about bees is that they go through their lives and with gentleness. They're taking from the flowers, but they're also giving to the flowers. And when they are pollinating, they're taking the pollen, but they're also creating a system of life for the flowers. And so I think that I found solace in understanding bees and their communities, because I also have been completely overwhelmed by the violences of the world. You didn't hear the poem tonight, but I write about the violence in the world, and I wonder about how to move forward from that. And my son had an experience of being held up at gunpoint and surviving that. And his response after the experience, I was very angry that he had been, assaulted, and my son said, I wonder what happened to those people that did that to me. What happened to them that would make them act that way? And I remember thinking that act of compassion, that act of empathy that he exhibited after experiencing violence was so shocking to me. And also it was such a great teacher also to me to think about, like, how can we make a world where people don't feel as desperate, and how can we calm the violences that we have? We're in a moment that's very volatile, and I will confess that I don't know if poetry is the way out of it. All I can do in my classes is to bring them things that I think might offer a sense of beauty, a sense of the honey that you talk of, but also to teach them to listen to each other. And I don't know what it's like to live in your part of the world, but I know that I would like to be a community member of the globe, and so I would love to learn more from all of you about what we need. Because I don't know. I would like to be a part of healing in the global community, and what I have to offer is what I've noticed, in my own experience about managing that sadness and that fear, and I think the thing is that the poem that Duaa read at the beginning is really about that. I thought to myself, when I had children, I thought, I'm bringing a child into this world that has both violets and beheadings, right? That we have the beauty and the violence, the suffering. And how do we make sense of that? The first thing would be to just close down and say, I am putting up my armor. I refuse to care. And that's one of the choices, is to completely become frozen. But what I hope is that for the children, that they will try to be open to love, try to be open to kindness and listening. And I'm it's funny because there are many people that accuse me of having hope that's not real, that I'm a poet that believes that there could be a better world. And in fact, the world is what it is, and it's not going to change. And they'll scoff at my hopefulness. But I'm going to cling to it because it's what's getting me through.
I think it's
how I survive.
Great. Keep it, Heather. Keep it. It's beautiful. I hope that before we end, you could read us this poem about not seeing the talon or the beak. It's
okay.
Beautiful. Please, yeah. But let's take these quickly, because I know that they're very keen on asking you questions. We have Hiba, and we have Raneem, and we have an iPhone. There is no name to it. So quickly, please, because we're running out of time. Hiba Jasser, yes, yeah.
Hello, good evening. It seems like I had wanted to lower my hand already, because it seems like after Dr. Jihad's comment and Dr. Heather's answer, I had no question. My studies are currently related to eco-linguistics. And I was just thrilled when Dr. Heather mentioned eco poetry and stuff, after some feelings of probably wanting to give up on this, believing that eco-linguistics doesn't matter to the world anymore and stuff like that. But after listening to this, I'm really glad. I had wanted to ask Dr. Heather, how optimistic is she regarding the future of eco-linguistics or eco-poetry, or relating nature to our work in language. But she had just talked about what she personally does. And I would just link this to the fact that we all do whatever is convenient in relation to our culture, because eco-poetry and eco-linguistics cannot be they're interrelated with culture. We do different things in different ways. So
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa.
Please don't give up your studies. I mean, I think that we need, and I think it's so important to point to that that issue of the culturally specific imagery, language, and the poetic form, and what that does for each culture. It will be different, right? But that the earth is something that we all share, and so we will all have different relationships with that. And so your work will be very important, obviously. But I also think that that one of the things that I think about that gives me hope is that when I have students right now who just went through the pandemic. They've been all on their phones and completely disconnected, because they've been in isolation, and the technology has been the way for them to communicate with the world. And when I take them outside and I rekindle their sense of wonder with the natural world, I feel very optimistic. They feel optimistic because of connection, because of the connection to the life around us, and that continues. And so I think that we're going to have a really different world that we'll be navigating. But I think that when we say that it's, the students that I teach, this generation has been taught the apocalypse from day one. There are people that are growing up with no hope at all. And I think that part of it is to say, there is a possibility of shifting that. And if we're only teaching the apocalypse, what use do you have trying to fix anything? But if instead we teach connection,
but it's the big gap. There's a huge gap between what we are aiming at and the reality, especially if we take into consideration the violence just described by Dr. Jihad. And even in UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals, for example, published, it's clearly mentioned that this is pretty much dependent on culture and our beliefs, and like you said, who the bad guy is, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is that we're all complicit. I mean, all of us. I feel like all of us are living in the systems that we have been creating for forever, and so to move out of those systems and to shift those systems will be incredibly complicated. But should we give up? I don't think so. I think that, there was a great quote, and I can't think of who said it, but the idea was, the apocalypse may be arriving, but we will still fall in love. We will still want to eat a berry that is sweet, eat the honey. There's still we will still be human beings in this new world, even in the world that we're in now, which is facing so many terrible things. It's I think we need to remember, again, I don't have the answers. I have the questions, but what I think is that inviting empathy, inviting beauty inviting wonder might be transformative for people. Again, I don't have the answers. And
I think, Heather, also that the fact that the world is going crazy and is so violent, that we need to keep going on, and that we need to be a counterforce, because that's why we're here. I mean, that giving up is in itself is not only a defeating gesture, or in the sense that it's giving in, but I mean that's part of our resilience. That's part of why we're here to start with, is that if things go wrong, we have to put them back on the right track. It's part of our mission, part of our existence, part of who we are. So in that sense, we are also defending our own humanity in that sense by fighting for the things that we believe in. We insist on our identity as human beings, as creatures who were given this kind of a great, it's a kind of great gift, and all this privilege that we need to keep and make sure that it's in safe hands. But anyways, I think we're running out of time, and unless my two students, if there's something urgent you want to ask about, different from others, then please ask. If not, then let's wrap up and ask Dr. Swan to read us her beautiful poem about her son's experience, because I feel that it also sums up everything that you're trying to say in such a beautiful, poetic, and aesthetic way that will be a great end to this wonderful talk.
It's funny because it's one that I think is slightly, it's a bit controversial, so I feel like it's a funny one to end on, but I guess we'll do it.
It's all right.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to find it because I don't have it. It's in my book here. Okay. So the poem is, as I said, it's about my son being held at gunpoint. And there's an epigraph to the poem by Audre Lorde that says, we have to consciously study how to be tender with each other until it becomes a habit. And so maybe this is one of the, this quote may be answering some of the things that we're talking about right now. Consciously studying how to become tender with each other. Anyway, empath. The pistols glinted in the moonlight, pouring through the trees by the bike path as the two men robbed my son and his friend. One gun pressed to his friend's temple as he lay face down on the ground. The other pointed at my son's chest. They obeyed. He obeyed, slipped off his backpack, emptied his pockets, handed the taller man his chapstick and his phone, which minutes before had sent a message on my way to me. He knelt down and turned his back when asked, as one might before uttering a prayer, the universal gesture of supplication. In the grass, damp with dew, he prepared for the closing of night, the silencing of tree frogs, but the gunshot never arrived. Instead, the men ordered them to run away, and so they ran, hearts glad to be pounding louder than their footsteps like bass drums at some celebratory parade all the way home. Later, telling me the story, he says he imagined as he ran the desperation of those men, not much older than me, that pushed them into a life like that. Like a rabbit looking up at the hawk and seeing not talon or beak, but the soft underside of the wing.
Wow. Wow. It's a matter of perspective, my love. It's a matter of perspective. Yes. Yes, we have one last, someone begging to ask a question. Okay, Osama.
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Hello, Professor Heather. It's a pleasure to see you. The poem you just recited, Professor Duaa recited it before last week, and I really was interested about it. And I had really one question about it, is that what was your son's reaction when he read it?
That's so nice that you would ask that question. My son knows that I write poetry about all the major experiences in my life, and he knows that I feel sometimes like he's my teacher. He has always, since he was a young person, had a great capacity for empathy that was sort of surprising, uncanny, really, how he was so able to see someone who was doing something that seemed, violent or angry, and to say, what's behind that, and where did that come from? And I admit that I didn't always feel that way. When he said those things, I was so surprised. So when he saw the poem, I think he just felt like, yep.
Yes. Yes.
That's right.
I did it. I made her change her mind. Yes. Wow.
So, thank you. I want to say that I feel like I have not often been in a situation where I'm giving an academic talk where I've been able to be so honest about things that I care very deeply about, and also to be invited into thinking about another part of the world that is very, very different from mine. And I'm very, very, very grateful to all of you for asking the difficult questions and for bringing up these very difficult things. I have so much to learn, and I think that I feel so blessed to have been with all of you today. And I hope that if there are other things that you'll reach out to me. I have more to learn. So thank you for letting me
very
be here
much.
with you.
Yeah, Raneem, I know that I don't want to disappoint anyone. yes, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Doctor. I was trying from the first of the meeting to say, like, to really participate though. So I wanted to thank her about her talk today and reading her poetry. And I really like the whole description of nature and the way she's capturing all this. And I think her poetry reflects her life since she was a beekeeper. I like the way she's connecting life with nature and rain, lots of alliteration similes. And the use of words actually like Victor and Whispers as like examples, brand names for pesticides. These words are really like used to label something that is toxic, and they have been co-opted from English, and I think she like took them back. And there is a poem called Damaged for her. I really like it because we're all kind of damaged, and to think about how to go forward when we feel damage of institutional racism and we need extra care. So I guess this poetry or this poem called Damaged show how might that look. And I was going just to ask her if there is did any one of her family members used to write poetry, so she got influenced by them. And I'm so sorry for talking a lot.
No, thank you, Raniam.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I do feel like we all are damaged just by living in this world. If we're sensitive and we're paying attention, there's a lot of sadness and a lot of suffering, but there's also so much beauty, so many moments of grace. And I feel like, the thing about that poem that you're referring to is about how we can be gentle with each other. And when someone is really damaged, they'll be very nervous, right? And I was thinking about a horse that has been abused as an example of how we have to earn trust from each other, right? That it's not clear to the person that we're talking to that immediately that we don't mean any harm. And for someone that's been harmed, there's a culturally harmed or personally harmed, I think there's a defensiveness there that we have to learn to move through very slowly and with kindness. And so anyway, so that's what that poem was about. And thank you for recognizing that institutional racism would certainly be one form of damage. I have not had any poets in my life. My father used to recite poetry to me when I was a child sometimes. And so I know that language came in. But I didn't have any poets in my family directly, but again, I think that the artists that I was around probably informed my sense of use of language. Mm-hmm.
Well, like everything else, this has to come to an end. We'll stop, but I'm sure the conversation will keep going on. We have to stop this for just, for just the end of it. But I mean that it's the formality of the whole thing. Things need to be to come to an end. But thank you very, very much for this illuminating, for this highly ethical sort of approach to the world that allow us to think about this, about us as one community, the sense of community that you really emphasize throughout, that we learned from also nature and from bees and from insects and from animals. So yeah, I think this is a different take on academia, but it's also part of it because it should be part of life and it should be encouraging us to think about these things. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for doing such a brilliant job. And thank you everybody for attending and for all your enthusiasm and for your questions and input. So yes, we hope to see you more. Yeah. And maybe at a certain point, we'll just invite you to recite your poems to us. Okay. Mm-hmm. and to enjoy, but really, thank you for your generosity. Okay, everybody. So yeah, Dr. Dina.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Heather. I don't know if Dr. Jihad would like to say something.
Once again, I would like to thank Dr. Heather. And in fact, this was very special talk to us, intimate talk. productive, just like that of bees. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I feel like I have so much to learn from all of you, and so much more to read and think about. So thank you for listening to my ideas and my poems.
Thank you very much. Okay.
I hope you all have honey later in your life. I hope you get to go and have some.
I think we got some metaphorical honey.
All right. Thank you so much, all of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Night.